lifestyle of these people who've been called the parents of our republic.
There was also, interestingly, a rainbow up there as well, right, kind of up in the sky. And I would say that's, in remembrance of the great promise that God made. That when you see when you find yourself in a whole bunch of water on a ship, remember this isn't going to be the end. This isn't the destruction of you. And that must have been very comforting thought for them as they're going over there. Boy, I hope we see lots of rainbows because we're going to be out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean.
So they come together, they pour everything into this, just like they did when they left England. They sold everything they had. And they had to even go in debt to get this ship, just to hire it. It's called the Mayflower. It's a former wine ship. It had never crossed the Atlantic. Very few ships had ever crossed the Atlantic. In fact, it was just to go around the ports of England delivering wine. This time they've got 102 passengers. They've got about 30 crew members. And they take off late. I mean, nobody travels in September, October, November on the North Atlantic in the 16th century. You're crazy. But they did. And as they took off in the fall of 1620, not knowing that their 3-week journey was going to be an 8-week journey that was going to take 66 days.
So what was it like on the boat?
Well, if you can imagine constant gales in the North Atlantic on a little boat like this, and having a boat with nothing to protect the water from going down underneath. So in that one deck that is below the main upper deck, you basically have it 4.5 feet high. You've got 102 people crammed in there. They're going back and forth at a 45-degree angle. They're all huddled together. Water is pouring down on their head, so they're constantly wet. They're barfing. Their children are barfing. They've got constant sickness and disease. They've got everybody going to the bathroom and trying to hide the smell. I mean, it must have been horrendous. They had no idea where they were. The ship was almost out of control. They find themselves with a ship that is now breaking. The main beam that holds the whole ship together, which goes horizontal, has now cracked and is coming down, and the water's pouring in. At that point, the captain comes down and said, well, prepare to meet your God. This is it. And the Pilgrims had brought, providentially, a giant screw, which was one of those screws probably that holds the bottom of a house together when you're lifting it up. And so they pushed it just right into place, at the right place, put a log underneath it, twisted it in, and saved the main beam, which of course saved the ship, which saved them from disaster.
What kind of person you have to be, what kind of father you have to be to look your wife and your kids in the eyes and say, we're going to get on this kind of a boat. I know it's never crossed the Atlantic. I know this doesn't look possible, but we're going to go because it's worth it. I mean, what kind of character do you have to do something like that with your family? I mean, you're either crazy or you've got courage and you've got faith.
These are the real people that founded America. And they were real. Were they perfect? No. Did they cry out and scream? I'm sure, in fear. Were they afraid? Yes, they were. But they carried on and persevered. In fact, William Bradford, their governor, said, if we are to lose our lives in this endeavor, at least we know that our cause is just and our cause is honorable. So their perspective was, do the right thing over the long haul, and in the long run, God will bless it.
And when you look at their life, they certainly display that trust and confidence in God. You know, from the movie tells it so wonderfully, the great persecution they endured and the hardships in Holland. But William Bradford is clear because he wrote their whole history, compiled that history we call of Plymouth Plantation. And in that history, he reveals why they came to the New World. They wanted a place where they could freely worship God. They wanted a place that was more conducive to raising godly children. Lastly, which was not least, the great hope and inward zeal they had of laying some good foundation, or at least to make some way thereunto, for the propagating and advancing of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ to those remote parts of the world. William Bradford wrote. And so we can see their heart. We recognize that we are a part of something God is doing. We want to be instruments. We want to be stepping stones that we might be used by Him.
So we see the story, how it's played out. We started in creation, and we saw that man was to govern himself, and when he failed to do that, God lays out a rescue plan, a mission, which results in him sending another Adam who rights everything the first Adam did wrong, restores us to our Maker, fills us with power to now be able to govern ourselves under God's laws, His words, His principles in the New Testament and the Old, and He slowly begins transforming the world through the release of the gospel and Christianity, all the way to where now the Pilgrims come over and begin planting seeds to start a brand new nation from scratch using these principles.
And one of the important things they did is draw up a new concept of civil government.
They made that covenant with God and with one another in a document that is now known as the Mayflower Compact. And they did this while they were still on the boat. So I met with Dr. Paul Jaley, the president of the Plymouth Rock Foundation, to help me understand the real significance of the Mayflower Compact.
They come into agreement, saint and stranger, those from the Church of England, those from the Separatists, they join together in a civil body politic, which is of course larger than any one church. It's going to have to serve everyone. This was an act of self-government. This was not an act from somebody else telling you who your government was. In fact, they had this phrase, this would be as sure as any patent. In fact, maybe even more sure. In other words, because we did it from our own hearts.
Right.
And you think about it this way, if you have a say in the laws, are you going to be more apt to be submissive to them?
Sure, of course.
And you can voluntarily consent. So that's why I would think Bradford probably meant, look, it's going to be even more sure than a patent when we do it ourselves.
Right. Because it's coming out of the convictions of our own heart, and everyone gets a say in this. It's not just the king and the top down.
Exactly.
You know, they intended to settle in the north part of Virginia. The charter they had gave them authority to settle there, but when they were providentially blown hundreds of miles north of their intended destination, some of the non-pilgrims said, no, when we go ashore, we're going to do what we want to do. And that's when the Pilgrims got together in the Main, drew up that compact. And it's significant because it is built upon the biblical idea of covenant. They recognize that to build a civil society God's way, we need to covenant together under Him and His law to construct this new civil society we're going to live in. But the reason they could do that in the civil realm, now you've got to realize these are farmers, new other tradesmen and people, but they have been learned how to reason biblically to all of life by their pastor and their biblical training. And the reason they could come up with this civil covenant is because years earlier, back in Scrooby, they had come up with a church covenant. You know, when they reasoned that the Church of England was unbiblical and wasn't going to be able to be purified, they separated from the church and drew up a church covenant. Because they said the church is not people who live in a geographic area. That doesn't make people part of the church, but it's a people who have been called of God, who have a common vision to fulfill His desire and plan for man. We covenant together to work in union to advance God's purpose. They had done that in the church realm. Now they were doing it in the civil realm. And this is one unique thing about America's form of government. It's built upon the biblical idea of covenant. That's
Now,
what
what's the
makes it
difference
unique.
between covenant and, say, a contract or an agreement? What do you mean by covenant?
Well, covenant, that's what the term covenant means. It does mean an agreement, but in the biblical sense, you obviously are covenanting not just people together who we think we're sovereign and we'll make our own laws, but they're covenanting under God, recognizing that you are the source of our life, law, morality, and we want to abide by your higher standard, your higher authority. That's where, obviously, the Pilgrims looked, as they clearly stated in that Mayflower Compact.
And that sounds a lot like what was going on in Israel under Moses. This was a covenant that they made with God, saying, we want you to be our leader.
It's exactly the same thing.
And we have representatives here on earth that we will elect to represent tens and hundreds and thousands. But ultimately, we want you to be our provider, our protector, our Savior.
And that is a key component to what made America an exceptional nation. Unique. Israel had it, and there's seeds of it we see with Patrick and others, but really not to the degree until we have the planting of the American Christian Republic, and the Pilgrims certainly were a key part of that planting. And so they came. And by the way, in modern history books, when you read about the Pilgrims, usually they ignore God, which is, how can you learn about the Pilgrims if you ignore God? But a lot of times they'll say, well, the Pilgrims came for religious and economic reasons. Well, that's somewhat true. Certainly we know their primary motive, but when you examine their economic reasons, William Bradford writes that it was so difficult in Holland for them to make a living, laboring so hard, their children even had to work, and they were getting bowed under the weight of that work. Not only that, but there were other separatists back in England who wanted to come join them, but they said it's so hard economically, we would rather suffer the miseries and persecution in England than suffer the miseries of the economic challenges you have. So Bradford writes, the Pilgrims said, okay, if we can find a new place with economic freedom, then it'll enable us to prosper from the fruit of our labor, then more of our brethren may come and join us. That was their economic motive.
That's right.
And so they came to America, and as pointed out in the film, you know, they suffered a great hardship. That first winter, half their number died. But God in His providence, He has a plan for us. He provides for us. And they were introduced to Squanto. William Bradford calls him a godsend. Why was that? Because Squanto himself had a providential story. Squanto was part of a tribe that lived right where actually the Pilgrims had settled. Earlier, he'd been carried away, taken to England by English sea captains, where he learned English and saw how the whites settled. Then he came back to America to see his tribe. Then he was carried away, captured by an English sea captain, and carried and sold as a slave. And some monks in Spain bought him and rescued him from slavery, and he stayed with them for a while and made his way up to England, was carried back then to New England again by Captain John Smith, interestingly enough. But when he arrived at that time, he found out that all of his tribe had been wiped out. See, in 1617, a plague had mysteriously wiped out every one of this particular Indian tribe. And that's why when the Pilgrims arrived in 1620 and the English sea captain said, find a place to live right here. We're not going south where you were initially intended to sail. They found a perfect spot. No Indians lived there because a couple years before that, a plague had wiped out every one of them, and no other Indians would come and live there for fear the same thing might happen to them. So Squanto came back and found out his tribe had been wiped out. He was despondent, what am I going to do? And he joined himself with a nearby Indian tribe. So when these white settlers came to settle right at the very spot where his brethren used to be, he took them under his wing. He said, okay, I know English, I've learned English, I'm going to teach them how to survive in this new world. So he taught them how to plant corn, how to fish, and without him, they may not have survived. After suffering so much that first winter, half their number died. God did send Squanto, and they planted a crop that it looked like, okay, we might be able to make it through this next harsh winter, 1621-22. And so they had that first Thanksgiving in the fall of 1621. Some 90 Indian braves came, brought deer with them and other food to eat. And they met together for a number of days. The Pilgrims gave Thanksgiving, they ate, they prayed, they played games and other things, and that's where we trace our tradition today of Thanksgiving.
Bradford also tells the story of another Thanksgiving 2 years later in 1623. After that first one that you mentioned with the Indians, they still weren't prospering very much with their crops. And so Bradford said, wait a minute, we've got to change the way that we're working here. And they were using this socialistic, communistic structure of having common lands and common crops and common fields. Well, that doesn't work very well, and he understood that, and so he said, wait, we're going to divide this up and say each man's got his own plot of land, and you plant your stuff, and if you don't work, you don't eat. Well, that got all the lazy guys up off their duff, and they began working, and pretty soon the crops started coming up, and they were producing, and it was fantastic. However, when the summer came, the rain didn't come. And Bradford said, wait a minute, we have done the right thing here, but what we failed to do is thank God. We have failed to call out to God and to repent of our sins and to fast and to pray. And so they began to fast and they began to pray. And as they did this, he says that a gentle rain began to fall. It came over the course of days and softened that soil and watered the plants, and they had a big harvest, a big bountiful harvest. And it was in that fall that they had this wonderful Thanksgiving feast. And this is when they had plenty of food, plenty of animals, plenty of crops, and it was, I think, more in lines with the kind of abundant feasting that we think of today at Thanksgiving time.
And this is another example of how Christian truth produces liberty. Because when they began to apply biblical economic principles, see, the first 2 years, as you pointed out, they were constrained by the contract they had with their financial backers to farm the land in common. It wasn't their choice, they had to. But under emergency powers, of them almost starving to death, they put off that socialistic Marxist economic system and embraced the biblical system of you benefit from the fruit of your labor.
Right, the free enterprise.
Yeah, I love what Bradford said. He says, this made all hands very industrious. Even women went out into the fields, which beforehand would have been thought great tyranny. Why did they go out? Because the winter before, they had gotten to the point where there was so little that their daily rations were 5 kernels of corn. So they said, we're not going through that again. So they planted 6 times the amount of crops when they shifted to that individual enterprise system, private property system, than the year before. And so from that harvest of 1623, there has been no famine in our land because we put off the Marxist system and we embraced a free enterprise system, and it shows us God's principles bring liberty in the civil realm, in the economic realm, in the personal realm, in every realm. So the Pilgrims provide us marvelous stories, examples of Christian character, examples of the price that's necessary to advance the cause of liberty, and the fact that God can use anyone, common people, to impact nations, because they were the seed of this American Christian constitutional republic that we live in today.
Het weer wordt mede mogelijk.